April 15th, 1912, 2:20 a.m. 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking an iceberg on her maiden voyage, RMS Titanic makes her final plunge to the sea floor, casting 1,500 people into the freezing North Atlantic Ocean. This would be the last time anyone would see the ship for decades. Even as early as a few months after the disaster, people were thinking about trying to locate the wreck, but the technology was too primitive to achieve that. It wouldn't be until the second half of the 20th century. This is how the wreck of the RMS Titanic was discovered, and how the ship is rapidly decaying over the years. Most of us know that the Titanic was not famous until she sank. 10 months prior to her maiden voyage, her sister, the RMS Olympic, stole all the fame and became one of the most famous ships in the world. When Titanic set out on her maiden voyage on April 10, 1912, there were not crowds of people cheering the ship on like what we see in the movie, because, even though she was the largest ship in the world at the time, she only succeeded Olympic by a slight percentage, even though when Titanic sank, she became one of the most famous ships in the world. But even decades later, Titanic was still catching in popularity, and that was one of the reasons why most people weren't interested in looking for the wreck, even though the technology was durable for the challenge. In the 1960s and 70s, proposals were made to locate Titanic's wreck and salvage the ship, but none were successful. One reason why the task of finding the wreck would be difficult was because when the ship sent out its distress call, the coordinates that the ship gave were about 13 miles, or roughly 20 kilometers off. So finding the ship in the vast North Atlantic would be like finding a needle in a haystack. In 1980, an attempt was made to find the wreck by Jack Grimm by going to the general area of where the ship went down. The only proof that the expedition team gave to prove that they found the wreck was a propeller blade found on the seafloor. But it couldn't have been from the Titanic because all of the ship's propellers are still intact on the wreck. In 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard told the U.S. Navy that he was interested in looking for the wreck, and he asked for funding to do that. Like I mentioned earlier, Titanic back then was not as famous as it is nowadays. But the U.S. Navy said they wanted to give him a different task. In the 1960s, the U.S. Navy had lost 2 nuclear submarines, more specifically the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion. When Ballard was told that, he essentially said, "Okay, I'll go look for those submarines for you, and if there's time left over, I will spend that time looking for the Titanic." Then Ballard set out to look for the Thresher and the Scorpion, and he found the wrecks of those 2 submarines at a depth of roughly 9,800 feet, or around 3 kilometers. And he found those submarines so quickly that he still had 12 days left to search for Titanic's wreck. In July of 1985, Ballard and his team set out looking for the Titanic, and to find the wreck, they created a roughly 150 square nautical mile search area around the area where the ship said it was in its distress call. The team used a type of underwater submersible called the Argo to look for the ship. After several weeks of skimming the seafloor, on September 1st, 1985, Ballard and his team came upon a huge wall that was the Titanic's hull. Then the team brought the sub to the surface and passed all of the rivets and portholes on the ship. At this point, they knew that they had found the wreck of the Titanic, and the incredible news reached the mainland. Now, of course, the wreck of the Titanic looks very different today than it did 38 years ago. But why? Well, of course, the wreck of the Titanic is at a depth of 12,536 feet, or 3,821 meters. And at that depth, there is a massive amount of water pressure that builds up on the hull. And it's not just the water pressure that has an effect on the state that the ship is currently in. It's also this kind of bacteria that eats away at the metal called rusticles. Essentially what they are tiny microscopic bacteria that destroy metal. And the rusticles destroy about 400 pounds of the ship per day. And there isn't much marine life at that depth that the Titanic is in. So the rusticles could chew away the Titanic like it's nobody's business. Of course, the stern section of the ship is going to give way first because the stern section of the ship is just a huge pile of metal, while the bow section is much more intact. Probably within a century, almost all of the wreck will be gone. But how come other wrecks don't experience much of these problems? Well, on wrecks like the Britannic's wreck, there is a little bit of sunlight. Not very much, but enough for life to grow in the hull. And there are rusticles at that depth. But the rusticles have to deal with the life growing on the wreck, which is why Britannic's wreck is much more preserved than Titanic's wreck. Well, as on Titanic, there isn't much life that the rusticles have to compete with. But wait, Why are wrecks deeper than the Titanic, for example the wreck of the USS Johnston? How come they are much more preserved than the Titanic, especially since the wreck of the USS Johnston is almost twice the depth as Titanic's wreck? Well, the USS Johnston is at a depth of 21,180 feet, or a little over 6 kilometers. There, the water pressure is much greater than the depth of Titanic's wreck, meaning that there is little to no life growing on the ship, and little rusticles that would eat away at the ship because of the extreme pressure. The USS Johnston is actually the world's second deepest shipwreck after the USS Samuel B. Roberts, and it's definitely worth its own video. But back to the Titanic. People have asked, should we recover artifacts from the wreck and bring them to the surface? Well, this has been done in the past. Dive teams have gone down to the wreck and recovered artifacts and put them in museums. We should be extremely careful when recovering artifacts because, of course, the Titanic is a grave. 1,500 people lost their lives when it sank. The thing that we should do is not go in and destroy the wreck just so we can get something. What has been done in the past is try to only recover artifacts from the ship's debris field that have been blasted out of the ship. That way we don't disturb the wreck itself. But no matter how hard we try to preserve the Titanic, within a century, it will be gone. I hope you enjoyed this video. Comment down below what you think I should do next for Titanic Month. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.